Have you ever felt that despite all your spiritual practices, meditations, and positive affirmations, something deep within you remains stubbornly unchanged? That familiar sensation of taking one step forward only to slide 2 steps back, as if some invisible force continually sabotages your progress. I've observed this pattern countless times throughout my career. This persistent struggle that leaves you questioning whether true transformation is even possible. The frustration becomes almost unbearable, doesn't it? The exhaustion of trying technique after technique, teacher after teacher, only to find yourself facing the same internal barriers. Many spiritual seekers become trapped in this cycle, desperately accumulating external knowledge while the true obstacles remain buried in the depths of their unconscious mind. This is precisely why purely spiritual approaches, while valuable, often fail to produce lasting change. They simply cannot reach the psychological structures that govern your behavior. Beneath the surface of awareness, what I'm about to share with you today represents a revolutionary integration of psychoanalytic understanding with spiritual development, a perspective that has remained largely unexplored in modern discourse. By examining the unconscious forces that shape your spiritual journey, we can finally address the root causes of your stagnation. Imagine being able to dissolve those persistent blocks that have followed you for years, perhaps decades, finally experiencing the freedom and expansion that spiritual teachings have long promised, but failed to deliver. This liberation becomes possible only when we have the courage to venture into the shadowy realms of the unconscious mind, illuminating what has remained hidden throughout your spiritual quest. If you've ever felt that inexplicable resistance when attempting to implement a new spiritual practice, or noticed how quickly you revert to old patterns despite your best intentions, I invite you to pause for a moment. Take a deep breath and consider what I'm about to reveal. My decades of clinical work with patients demonstrated conclusively that our conscious desires often represent merely the surface of much deeper psychological currents. The most profound spiritual revelations cannot override these unconscious forces unless they are first brought into awareness and properly analyzed. Let us begin our exploration by examining the most fundamental psychological structures that influence your spiritual development. What you perceive as spiritual blockages are, in fact, elaborate psychological defenses constructed in early childhood to protect you from overwhelming anxiety. Your unconscious mind, ever vigilant against perceived threats, will resist any spiritual practice that threatens to dismantle these protective mechanisms, regardless of how beneficial such dismantling might ultimately be. Consider dreams, for instance, those nightly excursions into the unconscious realm. How often have spiritual seekers misinterpreted these valuable messages, seeing them as purely metaphysical communications rather than expressions of repressed desires and unresolved conflicts? A proper psychoanalytic interpretation of dream symbolism can reveal precisely where your spiritual development has become arrested. In my clinical practice, I encountered numerous patients who experienced profound mystical states during meditation, only to find themselves unable to integrate these experiences into daily life. Analysis invariably revealed that these transcendent states served not as genuine spiritual advancement, but as sophisticated forms of psychological escape, a temporary flight from unresolved trauma. True spiritual growth cannot occur until these underlying issues are addressed directly. The spiritual symptoms most commonly reported, such as the inability to maintain a consistent practice, sudden losses of faith, or persistent feelings of unworthiness, all point to specific unconscious conflicts that must be resolved. Before authentic progress can occur, my approach treats these symptoms not as spiritual failings, but as valuable communications from the deeper layers of the psyche, signposts directing us toward the true areas requiring attention. Before I continue, I must ask you, have you truly been heard in your spiritual struggle? Has anyone taken the time to understand the unique configuration of your unconscious mind, the specific patterns established in your earliest relationships that now shape your spiritual journey? If you find value in this perspective, if something within you recognizes the truth of what I'm sharing, I encourage you to leave a comment below describing one pattern you've noticed repeating throughout your spiritual path. Perhaps it's a tendency to abandon practices just as they begin showing results, or maybe a persistent feeling of unworthiness. Despite intellectual understanding of spiritual principles, by sharing your experience, you not only deepen your own awareness, but contribute to our collective understanding of these psycho-spiritual dynamics. Additionally, your comment helps others recognize they are not alone in their struggles, creating a therapeutic community of seekers engaged in authentic psychological work. Now, let us return to our analysis of the unconscious barriers to spiritual development. The first significant barrier emerges from what I identified as infantile trauma, those earliest experiences of helplessness and dependency that leave indelible impressions upon the developing psyche. When a child's needs for nurturing and protection are inconsistently met or outright neglected, a profound sense of existential anxiety becomes established in the unconscious mind. This anxiety manifests in spiritual life as an inability to surrender, to trust the universe or divine presence. The spiritual seeker intellectually embraces concepts of divine protection and cosmic order, yet emotionally remains vigilant, controlling, and fundamentally distrustful. Consider how this pattern typically develops. An infant experiences unpredictable responses to its cries for nourishment or comfort. The developing nervous system records these experiences not as rational memories, but as somatic patterns of tension and vigilance. Decades later, the adult attempts meditation practices requiring surrender and trust, only to encounter inexplicable panic or resistance. This is not a spiritual failing, but the activation of ancient survival mechanisms, encoded in the body and unconscious mind. The symptoms in spiritual practice appear as intrusive thoughts during meditation, physical restlessness during contemplative states, or compulsive planning and worrying despite intellectual commitment to letting go. These manifestations connect directly to my theories of anxiety neurosis, where the ego develops rigid defense mechanisms to manage overwhelming internal states. Modern neuroscience has validated these observations, demonstrating how early attachment patterns create enduring neural pathways that influence adult regulation of emotion and stress. Brain imaging studies now confirm what my clinical observations suggested, that meditation activates precisely the same neural networks involved in early attachment security. For those with disrupted attachment histories, spiritual practices can trigger neurological stress responses rather than the intended states of peaceful awareness. Another critical barrier rises from what I term the Oedipal complex, that crucial developmental phase where the child must navigate complex feelings toward parental figures. Unresolved Oedipal conflicts manifest in spiritual life as idealization and subsequent devaluation of teachers or traditions, an unconscious reenactment of the ambivalent relationship with the parent. The spiritual seeker initially experiences ecstatic devotion to a teacher or path, projecting onto them all the omnipotence and perfection once attributed to the parental figure. Inevitably, disillusionment follows when the teacher or tradition reveals human limitations. Rather than integrating this more mature perspective, the seeker often experiences a traumatic collapse of faith, abandoning the path entirely and repeating the cycle with the next promising teacher or tradition. This pattern originates in childhood when the young child's view of the parent as perfect and all-powerful necessarily gives way to recognition of the parent's limitations and flaws. If this transition is not navigated successfully with appropriate emotional support, the child develops a splitting mechanism, categorizing others as either idealized or worthless. In spiritual communities, we observe this dynamic constantly, with students cycling through periods of worshipful devotion followed by bitter disillusionment. The characteristic symptoms include placing spiritual teachers on impossible pedestals, experiencing disproportionate rage when encountering their human limitations, and a persistent pattern of seeking the perfect tradition that will finally fulfill unconscious parental longings. This connects directly to my work on transference, where the patient unconsciously relates to the analyst as a parental figure. The spiritual path becomes contaminated by these unconscious projections, preventing authentic spiritual development. Recent psychological research has expanded on these observations, identifying spiritual bypassing as a modern manifestation of this dynamic, where spiritual concepts are misused to avoid confronting psychological wounds and developmental needs. Studies of cult dynamics further validate my original insights, demonstrating how unresolved parental issues create vulnerability to unhealthy spiritual authorities who exploit these unconscious patterns. Perhaps the most insidious barrier to spiritual development stems from what I identified as repression, the mind's capacity to banish threatening impulses and memories from conscious awareness. The spiritual seeker often approaches the path with an unconscious agenda of reinforcing repression, rather than resolving it, using spiritual concepts of transcendence and non-attachment to further distance themselves from disowned aspects of their nature. Consider how this typically manifests. A person with repressed anger adopts spiritual practices that emphasize peace and compassion, not primarily for their intrinsic value, but as a psychological reaction formation against acknowledging their rage, rather than truly transcending anger through integration and understanding. They create an artificial spiritual persona that requires constant maintenance through increasingly rigid practice. The original impulses, however, do not disappear but find expression through passive-aggressive behavior, psychosomatic symptoms, or periodic explosive outbursts that seem mysteriously disconnected from the spiritual identity. In childhood, this pattern begins when certain emotional expressions receive consistent disapproval or punishment. The child learns to disown these aspects of themselves, creating internal divisions that become increasingly elaborate with time. By adulthood, entire dimensions of emotional experience have been relegated to the unconscious, creating the psychological equivalent of a shadow that follows the spiritual practitioner, manifesting in precisely those moments when they believe themselves most advanced. The symptoms appear as incongruence between spiritual beliefs and emotional reactions, recurring inexplicable violations of spiritual values, or persistent psychosomatic issues that resist spiritual healing. This connects directly to my theories of repression and the return of the repressed, where disowned material inevitably seeks expression, often in disguised and problematic forms. Contemporary trauma research has validated these observations, demonstrating how dissociated emotional states persist in the nervous system until properly processed and integrated. Studies of spiritual communities repeatedly reveal how unacknowledged shadow material emerges in collective dynamics, creating patterns of hypocrisy, abuse, and corruption that contradict stated spiritual values. Conversion hysteria, another phenomenon I identified in my clinical work, manifests in spiritual life as dramatic physical or energetic experiences that serve primarily to express repressed psychological content. The spiritual seeker experiences unusual bodily sensations, spontaneous movements, or intense energy phenomena during practice, interpreting these as signs of Kundalini awakening or spiritual purification. While genuine energetic processes certainly exist in spiritual development, psychological analysis often reveals these experiences simultaneously express repressed sexual or aggressive impulses that have found an acceptable spiritual outlet. This pattern typically develops when a child receives messages that certain emotional or physical experiences are unacceptable, rather than disappearing. These experiences become converted into physical symptoms that serve both to express and conceal the original content. In adult spiritual practice, particularly in traditions that emphasize energetic experiences, these conversion symptoms find perfect conditions for expression. The characteristic manifestations include dramatic kriyas, spontaneous movements during meditation, overwhelming energy sensations with sexual undertones, or persistent physical symptoms that appear specifically during spiritual practice. These phenomena connect directly to my theories of conversion disorder, where psychological conflicts find expression through physical symptoms that have symbolic meaning. Modern mind-body research has expanded our understanding of these dynamics, demonstrating the neurological mechanisms by which repressed emotional material creates physical symptoms. Studies of spiritual emergency have documented how unprocessed trauma can emerge during intensive spiritual practice, often through somatic pathways, confirming the essential interaction between psychological and spiritual dimensions that my work originally proposed. Let us now turn our attention to narcissistic wounds and their impact on spiritual development. The child who receives conditional love based on performance rather than intrinsic worth develops what I termed narcissistic defenses, elaborate psychological structures designed to maintain an inflated self-image that compensates for the underlying sense of worthlessness. In spiritual life, this manifests as the use of spiritual accomplishments, insights, or states as narcissistic supplies, unconsciously pursuing enlightenment as a final, ultimate validation of self-worth. The spiritual path becomes distorted into a quest for specialness rather than authentic connection or transcendence. This pattern originates when parental figures relate to the child, primarily through the lens of achievement and performance rather than empathic attunement to the child's emotional reality. The developing psyche learns that value comes not from being, but from doing or appearing in ways that elicit approval. In spiritual contexts, this creates practitioners who unconsciously compete for recognition, constantly seek validation of their experiences, or become preoccupied with spiritual hierarchy and advancement. The symptoms include excessive concern with spiritual status, compulsive comparison with others' progress, and a secret disappointment when spiritual practices fail to produce the special recognition or exceptional states that the narcissistically wounded psyche craves. This connects directly to my theories of narcissism and the fragile nature of self-esteem, constructed upon external validation rather than internal security. Contemporary psychologists have expanded upon these insights, identifying spiritual narcissism as a specific manifestation, where spiritual attainments become co-opted into the narcissistic structure rather than transforming it. Research into spiritual communities consistently reveals how hierarchical structures often reinforce, rather than dissolve, narcissistic patterns, creating environments where advancement becomes a substitute for the unconditional recognition missed in childhood. Another crucial barrier appears in what I identified as masochistic character structures, where early experiences create an unconscious association between suffering and love. In spiritual life, this manifests as an attraction to unnecessarily ascetic or punishing practices, an unconscious recreation of the childhood dynamic where love and pain were intertwined. The spiritual seeker with this pattern will consistently choose the most difficult, demanding path, not because it offers greater transformation, but because suffering itself has become unconsciously equated with spiritual authenticity. This pattern typically develops when a child experiences care and attention primarily in contexts of suffering or self-sacrifice. The developing psyche forms an unconscious equation: I am valued and loved when I suffer or deny my needs. In adult spiritual practice, this creates an attraction to traditions that emphasize renunciation, suffering, and self-mortification beyond what the spiritual process actually requires. The characteristic symptoms include an inability to trust easy or joyful spiritual openings, suspicion of approaches that emphasize grace rather than effort, and a persistent pattern of creating unnecessary suffering within the spiritual journey. These manifestations connect directly to my theories of moral masochism, where punishment becomes unconsciously sought as a condition for receiving love or approval. Contemporary trauma research has validated these observations, demonstrating how childhood experiences create enduring neurological patterns that unconsciously recreate familiar conditions, even when painful. Studies of spiritual practitioners have documented how unresolved trauma can manifest as attraction to punishing spiritual regimens that serve psychological rather than genuinely spiritual purposes. Now, let us examine the intriguing relationship between what I termed the death drive and spiritual stagnation. The death drive represents a conservative force in the psyche, a tendency to return to earlier states and resist development or change. In spiritual life, this manifests as an unconscious sabotage of progress, a mysterious resistance that emerges precisely when significant transformation becomes possible. The spiritual seeker experiences a pattern of approaching thresholds of change only to retreat, often through apparently random circumstances or sudden loss of motivation. This pattern connects to the profound ambivalence with which the human psyche approaches genuine transformation, simultaneously desiring growth and fearing the death of familiar identity. The characteristic symptoms include recurring patterns of abandoning practices, just as they begin to produce significant results, unconscious creation of distractions or crises that interrupt spiritual momentum, or persistent dreams about death or dissolution preceding spiritual breakthroughs. These manifestations relate directly to my theories of psychological resistance, where the patient unconsciously works against the very healing they consciously seek. Contemporary developmental psychology has expanded our understanding of these dynamics, demonstrating how identity formation creates powerful conservation instincts within the psyche that resist fundamental change. Research into transformative spiritual experiences consistently reveals how psychological systems activate powerful defenses when core identity structures are threatened, creating the very resistance that spiritual traditions have long observed but inadequately explained. From a purely spiritual perspective, let me now introduce you to the foundations of an integrated approach to resolving these unconscious barriers. The first principle of psycho-spiritual development requires bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness through a process analogous to my psychoanalytic method. This involves careful attention to dreams, seemingly random associations, emotional reactions that appear disproportionate to their triggers, and patterns of resistance in spiritual practice. Unlike conventional spiritual approaches that often dismiss psychological material as mere ego or distraction, this integrated method recognizes such content as essential communication from the unconscious mind, offering precise guidance about what requires resolution. The analysis of dreams becomes particularly valuable, as dreams reveal both psychological conflicts and spiritual potentials in their symbolic language. Through consistent examination of this material, previously unconscious patterns gradually emerge into awareness, the essential first step in their resolution. This methodical process of increasing consciousness distinguishes authentic psychological work from spiritual bypassing that simply reframes or repackages unconscious material without truly transforming it. Modern neuroscience has validated the importance of this conscious awareness, demonstrating how bringing implicit neural patterns into explicit awareness creates the conditions necessary for neuroplastic change. Studies of contemplative development consistently show that practitioners who integrate psychological awareness with spiritual practice demonstrate more stable and integrated growth than those pursuing purely spiritual approaches. The second principle involves what I would describe as working through the patient and methodical process of engaging with unconscious material, rather than simply observing it. This requires emotional processing of previously repressed experiences, often accompanied by abreaction, the release of the original emotional charge attached to these experiences. Unlike spiritual approaches that emphasize detachment or transcendence, psychological working through requires fully experiencing what has been avoided, completing emotional processes that may have been interrupted for decades. This aspect of the work often involves temporary intensification of symptoms as repressed material enters consciousness, a phase that many spiritual traditions misinterpret as failure rather than necessary progress. The implementation of this principle creates a fundamental shift in approach, from spiritual practices designed to bypass difficulty to practices that deliberately engage with psychological material using the increased awareness and resilience that spiritual development provides. Contemporary trauma therapies have expanded upon this understanding, developing sophisticated methods for processing psychological material without re-traumatization, approaches that can be valuable integrated with spiritual practice. Research into contemplative development increasingly recognizes that transformative spiritual experiences often catalyze rather than eliminate the need for this psychological processing, bringing unconscious material into awareness where it can finally be resolved. The third principle involves recognizing the transferential nature of spiritual relationships and using this awareness to heal early attachment patterns. The spiritual teacher, like the analyst, inevitably becomes a screen for the projection of unresolved parental dynamics, rather than ignoring or spiritualizing these projections. This integrated approach works directly with transferential material as a powerful opportunity for resolving childhood patterns. This requires spiritual teachers with sufficient psychological understanding to recognize when they are being related to through the lens of transference, and students with sufficient psychological awareness to recognize their own projections. When both parties maintain this awareness, the spiritual relationship becomes a container for healing early attachment wounds, rather than unconsciously reenacting them. Modern attachment research has validated the importance of this principle, demonstrating how secure relationship experiences can literally rewire neurological patterns established in early development. Studies of spiritual communities increasingly recognize how unacknowledged transference dynamics create patterns of dependency, abuse, and disillusionment that undermine genuine spiritual development. The parallels between psychoanalytic technique and certain esoteric spiritual practices are striking and largely unrecognized in contemporary discourse. The psychoanalytic emphasis on free association, for instance, bears remarkable similarity to certain Tibetan Buddhist non-meditation practices that allow thoughts and emotions to rise without interference or direction. My technique of evenly hovering attention corresponds to advanced meditation practices that cultivate panoramic awareness without fixation on any particular object. Even the psychoanalytic setting, with its regular timing, protected space, and emotional containment, creates conditions analogous to traditional spiritual retreats designed to allow deeper material to safely emerge. What I propose is not a replacement of spiritual practice with psychological analysis, but a revolutionary integration that honors both traditions while recognizing their complementary nature. This integrated approach promises what neither discipline has fully achieved in isolation: a methodology that addresses both the profound psychological structures that bind human consciousness and the transcendent potentials that spiritual traditions have long recognized. Modern contemplative neuroscience increasingly supports this integrated perspective, demonstrating how meditative practices influence precisely the neural networks involved in psychological defense and identity formation. Research into psychedelic-assisted therapy provides perhaps the most striking contemporary validation, showing how these substances temporarily suspend psychological defenses while activating brain networks associated with spiritual experience, creating unique opportunities for integrated psychospiritual work. I must emphasize that this work requires patience and commitment. Beyond what many contemporary spiritual approaches suggest, the unconscious patterns I've described have developed over decades, layer upon layer of psychological protection built through countless experiences. Their resolution cannot occur through weekend workshops, momentary insights, or intellectual understanding alone, regardless of how profound these may temporarily appear. The dismantling and reconstruction of these deep psychological structures requires sustained attention, skilled guidance, and consistent practice over time. This stands in stark contrast to spiritual marketing that promises rapid transformation through breakthrough experiences or specialized techniques. What I offer is not a shortcut, but a reliable path, one that addresses the actual structures that maintain psychological suffering and spiritual limitation. Research on sustainable transformation increasingly supports this perspective, demonstrating that while peak experiences may initiate change, lasting transformation requires consistent integration practices that gradually reorganize psychological and neurological patterns over time. Studies comparing various approaches consistently show that methodologies addressing both psychological and spiritual dimensions produce more stable and comprehensive results than those targeting either dimension alone. In concluding our exploration, I want to acknowledge the courage required to undertake this integrated journey. Facing the unconscious requires profound honesty and willingness to encounter aspects of yourself that spiritual bypassing has allowed you to avoid. Yet this very encounter contains the liberation that purely spiritual approaches have often promised, but failed to deliver. By understanding the psychological game that life presents, you gain access to its hidden rules, no longer playing blindfolded against unconscious forces that have consistently undermined your spiritual development. The integration of psychoanalytic understanding with spiritual practice offers a revolutionary approach to human development, one that honors both the depths of psychological complexity and the heights of spiritual potential. This path does not offer easy answers or comfortable reassurances, but something far more valuable: authentic transformation rooted in genuine self-knowledge and integration of all aspects of your being. I recognize that this journey I've outlined is not an easy one, that it asks more of you than many spiritual approaches. The path of genuine integration demands courage, perseverance, and a willingness to face what has been avoided, perhaps for a lifetime. Yet I would not present this challenge if I did not also recognize the extraordinary capacity for growth and healing that exists within each human psyche. The very mechanisms that create your suffering contain, when properly understood and engaged, the potential for your liberation. You need not undertake this journey alone or without guidance. The community forming around this integrated understanding provides both support and collective wisdom, a space where both psychological and spiritual dimensions are honored in their complexity and potential. If you've found value in this perspective, if something within you recognizes the truth of what I've shared, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, where we will continue exploring these revolutionary connections between depth psychology and spiritual development. Give this video a like to help others discover this integrated approach, potentially saving them years of spiritual practice that inadvertently reinforces, rather than resolves, psychological barriers. Remember that genuine transformation occurs not through bypassing psychological reality, but through bravely engaging it with the expanded awareness that spiritual practice provides. In bringing together these complementary dimensions of human experience, we create the conditions for a wholeness that neither approach alone can fully achieve. Your journey toward this integration is perhaps the most important work you will ever undertake, as it addresses not merely symptoms, but the very structure of consciousness that determines how you experience existence itself.